Well, hello everybody, and thank you so much for coming along this evening. First of all, may I say a big thank you to John and all the staff at the Global Centre for coming up with this idea, for setting it all up, and setting the stage for what I hope will be a really good discussion. So thank you, John. Can I also say a huge thank you to Chrystia for agreeing to come along this evening. As John said, we were colleagues for a number of years at the FT. In fact, I think we had adjoining offices at one point, when Chrystia was the deputy editor. I was one step down on the pecking order next door, but we worked very closely together, and it's absolutely thrilling for me to see Chrystia again and to be here together and to have this conversation with her and with you, because we will open this up for questions. My role at the beginning, at least, is to set the scene a little bit. We're discussing the rise of popular discontent and what we can do about it, so we're going to try and keep that focus on what we can do about it. But I thought I would start a little bit with a quick run-round, sort of tour d'horizon of where we are in Europe. Not exhaustive, and hopefully fairly quick and dirty, we might say. And as John says, I've come from the front line. It tells you something about what's going on in Britain at the moment when somebody who's sitting in London watching the Brexit drama unfold is described as being on the front line. But there we are. So it is a moment, I think, in Europe of unprecedented upheaval. I was thinking back to 1989 and the early 90s when Chrystia was covering Russia for us, brilliantly, by the way, our youngest ever Moscow bureau chief at the time. And it was a period of astonishing upheaval too, but there I think there was a sense of optimism and hope, and it was good things were happening. Now we're unfortunately somewhat in the reverse, and we're in a situation where there's a lot of kind of anxiety and fear about where all this is leading us, and political institutions, national institutions, international institutions are coming under enormous amounts of pressure, and it's very disturbing and unsettling, and it's rippling out, and we don't quite know how it's going to end. So if I start very quickly in the UK, before you ask, I don't know what's going to happen. And nobody really does, and that includes Theresa May, and I don't think anybody who pretends to tell you what's going to happen is telling a lie. But what I do know is that it is an astonishing period. We have not, you could say that the British political system is being tested to destruction right now, following the vote. And just to sort of give a flavour, there was a kind of palpable shock on the night of the vote. And ever since then, there has been this terrible sort of sense of a sort of huge cultural division in Britain. You're defined now by which side you're on. Not long after the vote, my nephew got married, and I arrived in the countryside in Norfolk. And I arrived, and my sister said, I made a joke to my sister about Brexit. She said, no, don't say anything like that. Don't talk about it. And because it turned out that the bride's side and the groom's side were on different sides of the fence. And she did the seating plan to keep us apart. So that gives you a kind of idea. So that's where we are. And I don't mean to be flippant, because it is actually deeply serious, and we don't know quite how it's going to turn out yet, and no doubt we'll talk more about it. So moving to France, where I worked for several years before the Gilets jaunes. But in a funny sort of way, France is UK in reverse, because France elected Emmanuel Macron as this great hope, and those of us in Britain who were kind of on the Remain side were going, where's our Emmanuel Macron? This is brilliant. France has been sensible, and this man who has this message of inclusiveness, of developing European integration, and aspires to all the values that we would like to aspire to, and to reverse the tide of populism, has been elected. But then France turned around and gave us the Gilets jaunes not very long after, which is kind of like their sort of hit back from this popular discontent. And then if you just run very quickly round, we've had the rise of the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany. Now, because of the coalition between the two main parties, is the opposition. You have a right-wing party which is very against a lot of the values that are espoused by the centre of the global centre, as the official opposition in the Bundestag. That's pretty, when you stand back and think about it, that's pretty amazing. Italy, of course, we have the government of La Liga and Five Star. La Liga, very aggressively anti-immigration. They are locking horns with Brussels on many issues. They're fighting with their French neighbors. Spain, a little bit more complicated, but their election result on Sunday was not as kind of gloomy as some people thought, but nonetheless you have, for the first time since Franco was deposed, you have a kind of very strongly nationalistic right-wing party in the form of Vox. Hungary and Poland, we've had to coin this phrase of illiberal democracy because of the policies that have been pursued there. Again, really quite a confrontation with what we had come to think of as core European values. Even in the Nordic countries, where I also work, in Sweden, Finland, you have parties that are very aggressively anti-immigration, very verging towards the nativist, who have won significant seats in parliament and are almost in the role of kind of kingmakers when it comes to government. Sweden, just to give you a sense of the sort of topsy-turvy nature of it, the Social Democrats managed to get themselves a majority in parliament to form a government, but they had already been a vote on a budget that was put together by the right-of-centre parties. So you have a Social Democratic Party having to enact a right-of-centre budget in order to fend off the insurgents of the Sweden Democrats who are from this sort of anti-immigrant right wing. So lots of upheaval. And absolutely we agreed, one thing we very quickly agreed before we came in was not to forget Ukraine, and we certainly wouldn't forget Ukraine, but the election of Vladimir Zelensky is, how could you write that script? And I'm not going to try and explain it because I have somebody here who will explain it to you much better. But so this gives you, as I say, a very sort of quick run around the houses. Now, there are common themes that, and this is where we sort of try and pull this together. My colleague Gideon Rachman wrote recently that Brexit is the British version of a wider crisis. So we are seeing disaffection bubbling up on sort of at least three fronts. There's economic disaffection. There's the whole issue of inequality of outcomes, inequality of incomes, indeed. You see, for example, the Gilets jaunes, it's very clearly the small towns and the rural areas revolting against the more prosperous cities. On the social front, we've already obviously mentioned immigration and the rise, the revival of a kind of nationalism in Europe, which I think is very stark and very remarkable and worrying. And then on the political front, it's this sort of anti-elite. The traditional parties are no longer trusted. Indeed, they've been exploded, never mind fragmented. If you look at France, the two parties who governed France throughout the Fifth Republic, the socialists on the one side, obviously, and the right of centre, whatever it was called at the particular time. But those two parties have been almost completely wiped out, and they are really struggling to find any traction. So that's the sort of background in Europe, and obviously this isn't a phenomenon that's confined to Europe, as no doubt will go on. So, and the last thing I think that just to tee things up that we should look at is the role of what you might call the information revolution and the whole kind of digital distortion. I'm trying to avoid those two words. But it's a massive issue. So now, way too much from me. So Chrystia, to kick this off, I thought a sort of quick sort of double question almost. What's gone wrong? I mean, I wonder if you sort of share that kind of very sketchy analysis. But more importantly, what are the prospects of kind of restoring political impetus to a politics of pluralism, diversity, inclusiveness, the international order, which I know that you have, was the feature of your now famous speech to Parliament. How do we steer a way out of this, do you think?
Okay, well, you started off with a real softball, Hugh. Thank you for that. So let me just start by saying, John, thank you very much for hosting us. Hugh, bienvenue au Canada.
Merci.
Ça me fait un
C'est
très
un grand
plaisir de t'accueillir ici chez moi. Et ça me fait un grand plaisir ici de voir beaucoup de mes collègues de mon département et aussi beaucoup de nos ambassadeurs. Merci beaucoup. And I do have to admit that finding the time to be here tonight is in many ways an entirely self-indulgent act. It was an excuse to spend some time with Hugh, who is was a truly wonderful colleague and is a truly wonderful journalist. So thank you very much. Look, Hugh, one of the things, and this may surprise people here, it may surprise you, Hugh, but because journalists are actually like fun people to hang out with. I think it's one of the reasons I became a journalist. But the job of journalists is to be kind of dyspeptic in their worldview. You know, a journalist is supposed to be skeptical. You don't really, like at the FT you're allowed to be sometimes a little bit optimistic, but generally speaking, you know, the good story, yeah, I'm gonna get to him in a minute. You know, generally speaking, the best story is not everything's great today. That's not gonna be your headline. Politicians, on the other hand, part of our job actually, I think good politicians, part of the job actually is to be hopeful. I think leading with hope is extremely important. So perhaps due to the chairs we now sit in, I'm a little more optimistic than that tour d'horizon that you offered, which really, if we listened carefully to Hugh, I think we would all have to slit our wrists. And I think the European ambassadors, and pretty much all of them are here, like, that was a pretty tough report card that you just got from the Financial Times. So I'm a little more optimistic, actually a lot more optimistic, but I totally agree with, you know, the essential diagnosis you've presented. And I think you've zeroed in on kind of, you know, the core problem of our times, or certainly one of them, which is something that I think surprises a lot of us, has been a surprise, you know, for a lot of exactly the kind of people who are in the room, which is a seeming loss of faith in liberal democracy among the greatest beneficiaries of liberal democracies and in the countries that built both the post-war rules-based international order that benefited from it and who have had the strongest liberal democracies in their own countries. And like, that's the shocker, right? That in those places, in our places, people are saying, well, it's not maybe working that well. And I think you're quite right to point to that fact, that there are some real doubts. What do I think is the cause of those doubts? So as is established here, clearly already today, I used to work for the Financial Times. That tends to give you a worldview which is quite economically deterministic. And I do think at the end of the day, the single biggest driver of what so many of us are experiencing is, at the end of the day, our liberal democratic societies have, for the past 20 or 30 years, not been delivering that well for a lot of our people. The middle class has been hollowed out in all of our countries in varying degrees. The geography of that hollowing out varies in all of our countries. But that is a key economic reality. And to kind of rub salt in the wounds, that has happened at the same time that the global 1%, known to you, Hugh, as your readers, have, it's true. You know, those guys, and they're mostly guys, have been doing better than ever before. And, you know, we should not be surprised that people are saying, you know what, this really isn't working for me. And I need to try something different. I would add to that, and relatedly, I think that in sort of the past couple of decades, the people of Western industrialized democracies have had some very specific reasons to doubt in the sort of omniscient powers of their elites. And I would single out as two of the biggest issues the financial crisis of 2008, which kind of, particularly focuses one's attention on the hollowing out of one's own economic life and prospects, and also makes one question, are those, technical